All right, and I'll kick in.
Great.
All right, hello. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. I'm Jeremy, CTO at Sagely Health. For today's session, we're going to be doing a general Q&A with Sagely Health founder, Dr. Jason Sager. We've got some great questions from folks and some interesting topics to cover. In the future, we may dedicate these webinars to one given topic. So if anyone does have interest in certain topics, please reach out to me or anyone at Sagely Health, and we'd love to kind of consider what people want to hear. I want to thank everyone that submitted some of their questions ahead of time. I've gone through them. I've removed any identifying information. I've also kind of combined similar questions so that we don't kind of go over the same thing again. I know that some people have certain flavor to their questions, so feel free to follow up with us again afterwards. We plan to go for about 40 minutes today, and we'll see how that goes. As a reminder, today's session is being recorded, and so that we can share it online with those who couldn't make it but did submit questions ahead of time and anyone else is interested. To begin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sager and have him talk a little bit about Sagely Health. Dr. Sager has served as a pediatric oncologist, an educator, a patient advocate, and as a leader in cancer drug development. He has a deeply scientific understanding of cancer, and as I've seen personally, he has a very personal approach to cancer treatment in cancer patients. So, Dr. Sager, thanks for making the time today. I was wondering if you could just start by talking a little bit about Sagely Health. Why did you create Sagely Health, what it is, and what it does?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Jeremy, and appreciate the introduction. I'm very passionate about cancer patients and helping cancer patients to do better. As a result of that, I not only became a oncologist and specifically was in a pediatric oncology, a doctor for childhood cancer at Hopkins and the NCI, but then afterwards really tried to do more. The first step of doing more was to create drugs that would benefit patients. And I've done that for many years. What I've come to realize is that patients are not connected to these new drugs, nor the promise of the new drugs through what's offered in clinical trials. And when I saw this disconnect, I said, gosh, there must be a better way. Doctors, they're really busy. They don't have the time or the tools to really know what's going on out there. There's not just a handful of things. There's like 13,000 things going on in cancer right now. And that's exciting. And it's really exciting on the cancer drug development side and in the scientific side. But I want that to come through for the patients. And I just wasn't seeing it happen. And so I founded Sagely Health now with you and others about 7 years ago. And we've been working on tackling this issue sort of one step at a time. I think the technology that we've built up in-house is spectacular and really helps us to identify what is appropriate for the cancer patient so that we can deal directly with cancer patients and very quickly get them answers on what innovative therapies are out there that are likely to provide the best possible outcome for them. That's really what we're doing every day of the week.
Yeah, so along that line, I mean, we get questions from patients, and so one of the first questions we got was around this idea of surgery and why certain cancer patients have kind of surgery offered to them usually early on, and why other cancer patients don't. And I mean, I even know there's a lot of complexity to that, but can you kind of speak in kind of the most general terms, like why would you be offered surgery as a cancer patient versus not?
Absolutely. And really, what I found is that surgery is the opportunity. Unfortunately, it's the best thing that we can do oftentimes for cancer today. It's the only thing oftentimes that we consider to be in a state where we can bring a cure to cancer patients is through surgery. So patients who have low risk, who have a tumor in one place where it can be completely removed by a surgeon, that's going to be always the sort of the standard approach, is to try to get that tumor out and provide that patient with a cure. There are patients where we know that that's not going to be possible, especially in the metastatic state where the cancer has spread beyond where it was originally into different parts of the body. We know then that surgery is not going to do the job. And so we do our best to use other things. And actually we can succeed with some of those other measures, but it's not nearly as much of a guarantee as it is when it's in an early stage in a low risk situation. And then there's a lot of gray zones where a cancer may be borderline, it may be possibly removed by surgery, but maybe there's a close margin. There may be some cells that have escaped. All of these things we try to help patients to figure out. And then after that assessment, decide, is it surgery alone? Is it surgery plus other options? Chemotherapy, we'll talk about other therapies. Or is surgery not worthwhile? And moving to some of the other options, including innovative options earlier on, is really going to provide them with that best possible outcome. And that's what we do in analyzing and guiding patients.
Excellent. So you use a lot of terms there. I just want to dive in on a couple of them. So it sounds like, you talked about if the tumor that you're trying to operate on is kind of small, it's one place, you kind of see it clearly. And then you mentioned the term, I'd love to you explain a little bit, metastatic. So it sounds like, the tumor usually starts somewhere and then kind of grows and spreads. Can you kind of talk about like what's happening there?
Absolutely. So cancer is, just to take a step back, cancer is a disease of genetic origin, of genetic breakdown. Which that means is basically in every cell in the body, there's the DNA. That DNA is used as a library to tell that cell what to do. DNA can have errors created and caused and perpetuated in it over time. And so cancer is literally the result of an accumulation of genetic alterations in that DNA, which basically all means that cell that used to be normal and behaving itself now goes rogue, no longer knows what it's supposed to be doing, nor where it's supposed to belong. It starts dividing, it produces other cells just like it, and some of those cells then spread. And when those cells spread outside of the normal organ that they occurred in, whether it's the colon or the brain or the lung, they travel to other places. That's when we call it metastatic. They've traveled to some place that's distant to the original place. And again, what we know is that we can see a place, let's say you may have had colon cancer, they may see it in the liver. We know that cells are more than just in those places where we can see it. We know that there's microscopic cells in other places in this metastatic condition. And so that's what brings us to that understanding that surgery, even if we can remove everything we could see, it needs more. And that more can be, again, in terms of chemotherapy in addition to the surgery, something called adjuvant therapy, or it can be something more where surgery is not used at all. And we go with chemotherapy or an innovative therapy right from the get-go.
Excellent. So with metastatic, you've got these cancer cells that are spread out through the body. So it's just not clear where they are. You couldn't really open up a patient to find them. So you got to turn to kind of other ways of approaching it, which I think is probably a good segue into a question that we got from a lot of people, which is about alternatives to chemotherapy. And I feel like there's like this skipping of kind of understanding chemo and just saying, I don't want it. I've seen so much about side effects. It's just very in the consciousness that chemo is a very bad thing. So let's step back a little bit. And can you tell me a little bit like what is chemo and what is it designed to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So chemotherapy it's a bit of a misnomer because any drug that's used in the body for cancer could be called chemotherapy. And oftentimes some doctors, many patients, many people will refer to chemotherapy as anything that the patient takes to battle cancer, to fight the cancer. That being said, I use chemotherapy, the word, a little bit differently. And I think it's an important distinction. When I talk about chemotherapy, I'm talking about the traditional chemotherapy, those drugs that have been around for 50, 100 years, the drugs that are not particularly selective to the cancer. So yes, they hurt the cancer, but they also hurt the body. Largely, these are medicines that are used, and some of them are quite effective. But again, they're used in a way that damages the DNA of the cancer. Because that DNA is already damaged in cancer, the thought is that if we damage it some more, that cell will then die. And they're right. However, you're also damaging the normal cell's DNA, and those cells then become unhappy. They take time to recover. And so we get a lot of side effects from that traditional chemotherapy. So you'll see me talking about that and then differentiating that from some other really new, exciting areas. There's two that I think are important to think about. One is called targeted therapy, where we find out what's wrong in the cancer by something called sequencing, and then we go and use medicine specifically against that part that's broken, that genetically altered part. And again, when we have medicines to do that, then other very new one is immunotherapy, where we're using medicines to teach the immune system to see the cancer, to recognize that cancer, and then to attack it without us having to do so directly. And that immunotherapy is another very exciting area that has revolutionized some treatment in melanoma and other cancers recently.
So if there are other options available, like targeted therapies, like immunotherapies, why does it seem like every cancer patient is kind of immediately offered chemo? And we haven't really talked about radiation, but it feels like those are the only options. Maybe there are other options kind of off in the distance, but it seems like that's the starting point. Is that true, or and kind of should that not be true? I'm curious. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. It's one of the issues that, as a doctor, again, we face every day. It is true. And I say that it's somewhat unfortunate that it's true. It's understandable, and I'll explain to you why. The fact is that, the world, again, the way science is developed and these medicines are developed is that they test it in many patients. And when it's tested in so many patients, then they say, okay, this is now a standard therapy. For most cancers, those traditional chemotherapies are still the standard therapy. And so for 80% or more cancer patients today, when they're being offered medicine as a therapy, it's going to be those traditional chemotherapies. And the fact is, they can be helpful. In some cancer types, like testicular cancer, they can be curative. But in most cancer types, again, in that advanced or metastatic stage, they're simply just not going to be enough. And after some time, whether it's 6 months or a year or even 2 years, that cancer is going to learn how to still grow through it, or the body is just going to get too tired of it. And so the traditional chemotherapies have a shelf life. And at the end of that, we need something else. Some patients, and not inappropriately, would say, hey, if this chemotherapy is not going to cure me, I'd like to go after some of those other therapies now. And there's a way to do that, which is clinical trials. And that's what we help patients to identify and access, because we believe that we can assess that upfront and we can stack the deck. So in combining some of these innovative therapies, targeted, immuno, whatever it is, with the traditional chemotherapy or without, we can do better for the patient. And so that's where science is, and that's why we're bringing the science to the patient on day one.
So you kind of touched on this, but if someone is diagnosed with cancer and their oncologist is recommending that they go on a course of chemotherapy, whatever chemo, and I know there are lots of different types because there's lots of different cancer types and different versions of chemotherapy. But if they kind of have a feeling that may not be the cure for them, they're looking online, they may not understand the deep science, but they kind of get a sense that maybe this story doesn't end well with chemotherapy and it's going to be a real challenge. I mean, does accepting the chemotherapy preclude you from getting other things in the future? Are you turning off your options? That's a concern that I see from a lot of patients.
Right. So in general, the answer is no, although there can be opportunities for patients to do things up front before the chemo or with the chemo that they wouldn't have available afterwards. And some of those things could be significantly better than just the chemo. And so that's why we think it's important to take a look right from wherever you are, take a look at your options, and then discuss them with your doctor. Discuss very frankly. If you have a feeling that the chemotherapy or the standard therapy may not be curative, ask. Right. What's the chance, doc, that this is going to lead to a cure, that I'm never going to have to worry about cancer again in my lifetime? And see what the answer is. We set the bar at about 80%. So if the number is less than 80%, you can say, is it less than 80%? Is it like 50-50, doc? Or is it like 20-80? Or What is it? Is it really almost a sure thing? We set the bar 80%. For patients who have less than 80% chance of it being cured, we call it high risk. And that's when we go to work to find clinical trials and other areas of development that are, scientific development that we can bring to the patient today.
Yeah, and actually, the next question I have is a very more specific than some of the other ones. Obviously, it's not specific enough to go into the actual medical details of it. But we had a question from a patient who's had a couple surgeries. They had colon cancer, and then they had another mass that's next to their bladder. They've had a couple surgeries, and after the last surgery, they've been told by the surgeon that unfortunately the surgeon knows they haven't been able to get all the cancer out. They know there are cells, the cancer cells are left behind. So that patient is kind of fully aware that they still have cancer in their body that they need to deal with. And their question, like many other questions, was: is chemo at this point the only option? If they had the surgeries that they can have, and they're being offered chemo, I mean, in a general sense, would you look at that and say chemo is the only option, or would there be other things to consider?
Right. I would say that almost always chemo is never the only option. So in our 6-year history and my 20-year history of practicing before that, there is never a time where, when we look at innovative therapies, that we can't find something going on for those patients who are in unmet medical need. That's the way the industry talks about it, and they're trying hard to find innovations to benefit those folks. That's what we're trying to do, is to bring those innovations to them earlier. And so again, it's always wise to take a look at what's going on out there and have a discussion, a follow-up discussion with the doctor about it, even to get a second opinion about it. And so from my perspective, there is zero risk to finding out what's going on and then asking questions about, is it worth considering these? And then figuring out, sometimes there may be travel, and that's very hard, or make things hard. There may be other aspects. There may be less known about the safety. But in some cases, we can almost predict that it will be a better outcome. And even if they're doing the trial to make sure and prove that it's a better outcome, it's predictable. And in those sorts of situations, to me, it's a bit of a no-brainer to say, hey, yeah. And again, it's not necessarily to get away from the chemo, but to really take a look at what's the forefront of scientific knowledge that can be brought to me, to the patient, so that they have the best possible chance of not having to worry about this cancer coming back later.
Yeah, and not to editorialize too much, but I would say, like, one of the things I see with patients that I want to kind of make people understand is that if you explore a trial and the trial has some type of comparison, a lot of times that comparison is against the chemotherapy or the standard therapy for your cancer. So the idea of going on a trial is kind of, well, are you going to get something more innovative, or are you going to get the standard delivered by a very competent researcher? And I think that there's be a big kind of difference there.
Yeah, just to jump in, I think that there are benefits on doing a trial, even if you're getting the standard therapy. That being said, in oncology, I think there are two important concepts to mention. Probably 3/4 of the trials are actually not randomized. So you'll know what you're getting. And those
Right.
phase 1 or those phase 2 that used to be seen as sort of early, no, because of the science, we know that those are really selecting the right patients. So I would boldly encourage patients to look at phase 1 and phase 2 trials in addition to phase 3. And then the second thing, just to mention oncology, is that you don't find the case where they're going to give you a sugar pill without treatment, right? So you said you oftentimes compared to the standard therapy. That's right. You're never going to be compared to a no treatment arm or a placebo arm that's just a sugar pill. That's not ethical. And so we get a lot of questions, and almost every day we say, no, you don't have to worry. You're still getting treated no matter which way this goes. You'll either get the standard or you'll get the new thing. Of course, everyone would like the new thing, and we're working towards that day when we can provide the new thing to everyone. That being said, you're not going to get a no treatment or a sugar pill only.
So let's talk about the new things. So we touched on them before. We've talked about chemo, and I think regardless of its effectiveness, it just has a place right now in cancer treatment. So two types of therapies that you've mentioned, and I'll let you decide what you want to go into, but targeted therapy and immunotherapy. So can you just talk a little bit about what they are and why one would get offered them or not get offered? Though I think that's one of the more important things.
Yeah, as I mentioned, it's the unfortunate truth, but it is the truth that the standard approach usually is only the traditional chemotherapies, those that have been around for many, many years. So neither, in most cases, will targeted therapy, immunotherapy, or others be considered. You're right that sometimes radiation is put in there and sometimes not. Again, we're looking at everything that is possibly available. From my perspective, the gatekeeper to that is a test called tumor sequencing. And that tumor sequencing will help in two ways. One is it will tell us the genetic alterations and early on. And with that knowledge, we can then select targeted therapies at whatever point, wherever the patient is at that point in the journey, that are more likely to help the patient than not. And so that's an important test. That's a gatekeeper, is this thing called tumor sequencing. And you can request that from your doctor. Many doctors and most insurance companies have it covered. I still think it's best to be done on the original tumor, but there are blood tests today called circulating tumor sequencing or liquid tumor biopsies. You'll hear these terms. Those are all good. And so any patient that can get any one of those early on in their experience, in their journey, is going to benefit themselves by doing that. It also can help us in ways to understand when immunotherapy can be more likely to be useful. But honestly, there's a lot of therapies that are offered just for patients that are looking. And so it's a little bit about looking, for, whatever it's worth taking a look. It's really hard to take a look without getting expert help. And so that's why we made ourselves available to help guide patients identify the therapies that are most likely to be beneficial and bring benefit to them. There's no guarantees, but we can certainly up the ante. And so in doing so, bringing them those, putting it in a report that is basically medically influential, so they can present that report to their doctor, have a good discussion about it, and decide, are these things reasonable to consider? 95% of the time or more, the answer is yes. And so that's how we're doing what we do and moving the needle forward towards patients and science at the same time.
So this may be a little bit of a simplistic understanding of it, but with something like chemotherapy, you're basically inserting something that's close to a poison into the body and saying, hopefully this kills the cancer and doesn't kill the non-cancer cells. And so when you have this tumor sequencing done, that's giving you some information about the actual tumor, not just about the person it's in, but like what's happened in this tumor. And so that allows you to kind of deploy a medicine or a drug or a series of drugs that is really aimed at just that cancer, not that those cells of that cancer, what's happened there, not to the whole body. And then also that's kind of giving you clues of other therapies that might involve the immune system that might work, right?
That's right.
And so yeah, just to kind of say, we often have to kind of help patients get to this test and then also help their oncologist kind of sort it out and see what it means. So I think like this idea of targeted, I don't think we need to go too deep into it, but can you talk a little bit about immunotherapy? I'm still not sometimes exactly clear on kind of what that categorization of intervention means, and kind of like, I know it involves the patient's immune system, but can you talk a little bit more about kind of what it is?
Yeah. And certainly, again, I think it's the most recent sort of revolution in the science that has translated into a real benefit for many, many patients. It's very exciting. And it's an exciting time, and we haven't seen the end of it. So the fact is, we're still at the tip of the iceberg in terms of its ultimate sort of power and capability. I'm really excited about where things are going. But just to step back and talk about it for a second, it does involve the immune system of the body, and we know that the patient's immune system is an asset for doctors, for scientists, for the patient to battle their cancer. The problem is that immune system often doesn't see the cancer because, the cancer came from self. The immune system is largely there to repel and defend against invaders, foreign. You've got a virus, you've got a bacteria. It's really good about attacking those. Cancer, not so much. Now, it's not identical to self because remember, those alterations have occurred. And so, it's not like any other cell in the body, and yet it's still being sort of tricked by the immune system not to being attacked. And so what we're trying to do is to figure out how that works and where we can interrupt it. And the one really great example is in this molecule called a checkpoint inhibitor, called a PD-1 inhibitor or antagonist, where basically there is a system that was discovered about 5 or 10 years ago now, where the cancer was producing a protein on its surface that was basically cloaking it from and hiding it from the immune system. So that immune system was surveilling, it would see this protein and say, oh, nothing here, nothing going on here, right? What they learned is if they interrupted that signaling and they blocked that protein with something called anti-PD-1, there's about 8 or so drugs out there now that attack it, things like pembrolizumab, nivolumab. You may have heard of Keytruda or Opdivo. Those are the trade names for those. But this class of drug that interrupt that interaction, now all of a sudden, the immune system can start to see that tumor. Sometimes it's not enough, sometimes it is. But where we impacted patients amazingly well was in melanoma, where before this sort of interaction and protein was discovered, most of those patients, again, who were in late stage or advanced stage were unfortunately succumbing, were dying from their cancer at some point from the cancer itself. So it was life-limiting for them. We are now curing about 50%, about half of all of those patients. And again, what we're talking about is, tens of thousands of patients a year globally. And that's just, an amazing achievement. Now, I'm not satisfied with 50%. I want 100%. And so again, how can we go beyond that? And we're trying now combinations. Scientists are discovering how to combine that therapy with other therapies, whether it be chemotherapy or whether it be others. And, we're learning in lung cancer that is become part of the standard for some patients is to have that immunotherapy. But we try extending it even beyond. So you don't necessarily only have to have metastatic disease. Maybe earlier stage can get that immunotherapy. The immunotherapy is not without risk. About 10% of patients have severe side effects, but they're treatable and reversible. 90% of patients don't have severe side effects. And yet 50% of melanoma patients are being cured from it, compared to almost zero. So the upside is on the benefit. And so we look at the risk and the benefit, and we help the patient to assess these for themselves and make that determination of what am I willing to try here to try to do better. But the better can be actually much better sometimes. And that's what's really exciting.
How is immunotherapy delivered to the patient? Is it a pill? Is it intravenously?
Yeah, it can be all sorts of things. I'd say, newer medicines tend to be more intravenous. And so, and these are fancier medicines, which include antibodies or other, there's something called CAR T cell therapy, which is an exciting therapy where they take out your blood cells and they put in the lab and they teach these cells to attack the cancer, and then they give them back to the patient. So those are all intravenous. There are some oral therapies still. And again, we can go and select for patients who need one or the other, or prefer one or the other. Obviously, everyone does prefer oral, but the intravenous can be not so bad, especially if it's every month or so. It can be quite tolerable. So more important to me is what side effects these cause. But you find a variety of both intravenous and oral, more on the intravenous side, I'd say.
Got you. So we did have a question from someone about immunotherapy that kind of goes a little deeper, where that they've been taking an immunotherapy, and they've been told by their oncologist they're going to need to stop taking it next year. And their kind of worry was, it felt like they were giving up, or they felt it wasn't going to stop working, or like. So how does immunotherapy work? Is it something you take it forever? Is it maintenance? Is it and sometimes is it curative? Is it courses of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, a lot of it is that we're still learning about these therapies and how they work. Again, the thought is that we're teaching the immune system to do something different. And once it learns that, we don't necessarily have to keep teaching it. It's been taught. And so in that sense, most immunotherapies have been written to stop at 2 years because frankly, they just haven't seen benefit for giving immunotherapy beyond 2 years. But again, I just mentioned that, immunotherapy hasn't been around for more than 5 or 10 years. So it's still relatively short time. We're still learning. I wouldn't be surprised that if tomorrow we found out that someone got it for 3 years and did better, or one group of cancer patients or something like this. So again, I'd say the jury's not out yet. There's another reason to stop therapy, and that's when if they see the cancer growing, they decide it's not working. But that's not the sort of thing you would project a year in advance. And so this sounded very much like, the fact that most of the companies said, well, after 2 years, we're just going to stop because we just don't see evidence to say it's helpful to the benefit would have been delivered already in the 2 years, and therefore not helpful to go beyond that. But again, it's still early days in terms of that decision.
This being the US, I hope the reason here isn't, well, that's as long as the insurance company will cover it.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a side of the cost of these and the fact that they're trying to limit it to only the time period that we know it's useful for. But then again, that's also why 80% of patients get treated with standard therapy, the traditional, really old chemotherapies, is because they're inexpensive and we know they work. And okay, we'll use them for 9 months and then the patient will go on to other things. But, again, it's the sort of thing that it is entwined in the system. I don't think we can remove it, unfortunately. But the nice thing is that clinical trials are not always written that way. So at first, they will provide basically uninterrupted care and therapy for the patient for as long as needed. And needed is basically either the cancer grows again and therefore it's time to stop, or the cancer completely disappears, plus some period of time, like 6 months or a year or something like that. And you say, okay, well, there's no cancer to be seen. And so we can stop. And so I'll stop there. If we have time, it would be good either on this session or another session to talk about how can people monitor when cancer is gone, when it might come back, and that sort of thing. But again, that's a sort of a separate question.
Yeah, there's a few things that come out of today. I'd like to have a whole session on phasing of clinical trials and how that's evolved over time and how patients and doctors should think about that. And then additionally, the monitoring. Let's stay on clinical trials just for 1 sec, though. This idea of clinical trials, people have asked, like, when do I consider clinical trials? Because I think that a lot of people go to their doctor and they near the diagnosis say, what about clinical trials, doctor? And inevitably the doctor will say that comes later. And I think, as we talked about today, I think sometimes that is the right answer. Sometimes maybe your cancer has a very good response to the standard therapy. Maybe you are in a situation where chemotherapy might help shrink the tumor, and then other options will be available. But like, how does someone weigh this if they come to their doctor and their doctor's response is that comes later? I mean, should the patient accept that? What should they do in that case?
Yeah. And again, I understand it. It's how doctors are being trained. Frankly, it's what the FDA, which is the US regulatory group, and they're a great group. But again, that's where they were 5-10 years ago, where they said, if anything can possibly work, you must have that, for even if it's for a very short period of time, before you get to try anything new. They have since changed, and actually there was just a guidance something like 2 days ago, a new guidance for early stage clinical trials, which now allows patients to say, basically, if they don't have a curative situation, advanced, metastatic, or if their cancer is unresectable, meaning it cannot be completely removed, plus a healthy margin, then they get to say, I want a clinical trial. And they don't have to have jumped through all of the hoops. Again, this is now 2 days old. So things will take some time to change in the system, but it's an important way that the system is changing. And what I know today is that most trials, even if they request or require a patient to have certain therapies, and many of them do, have the standard first. And so if you have the standard, don't worry, the clinical trial is still there for you. But if you haven't had the standard yet, but you're looking at your chances and saying, no, this doesn't look great, I want something more now, you can object. You can say and sign off on a document. I understand that I'm, not taking the standard therapy, and I understand I'm going in for the clinical trial. Again, if it's on a clinical trial, it's going to be paid for by the drug company, so the insurance company shouldn't have a say in the matter. And frankly, I think for many patients, that is the right thing. For other patients, they want to go through the standard first, and that's absolutely fine too. And again, we can talk about the nuances there with individual patients so that they know and find the answer that they feel most comfortable and confident about, them and their families, because it's an important dialogue to have.
Yeah. I mean, I'm struck by, the New York Times back in June did the big story on the incredible trial of rectal cancer patients where all 18 responded and their cancers kind of melted away. And we've talked about that. And that really is a win for genetic tumor sequencing because they all shared this one very particular thing about their tumor. The thing that I was struck by in that study, and we talked about a little bit at the time, was that the requirement for that study was that you hadn't had the standard treatments, which in that case, as I understand it, was often surgery. And so there's a bunch of people who not only got probably pretty close to a cure. Obviously they're still monitoring them and they're going to see if the cancer stays away, but they also avoided a surgery and its side effects and its recovery. So I think that, when people are looking at trials early on, you're right, there's a lot to weigh there.
Yeah.
Because if you look at it, so I think like that conversation seems very difficult to have with an oncologist.
Well, again, we help with our reports and with our guidance, but there's two other things. One is I have to say that it is a difficult thing, but it's very clear that we do our best. We get the best for cancer patients the earlier we start. So when we have opportunities to get innovative therapies on the beginning versus, at any point in time, before the very end, we always do better. And so that's just something that we can directly observe over time. The other thing that I think is really important for patients to think about and consider is to ask for, it's not a second opinion. It's an opinion from not only the surgeon, but also a medical oncologist and a radiation oncologist from the get-go. That a plan for cancer, unless it's the earliest stage breast cancer where all that's needed is a lumpectomy and you're done, but anything other than the very simplest of straightforward situations, and again, we can help patients apprise their situation, then I really think that it is best to have a surgeon, a medical oncologist who gives the chemotherapy and other medicines, as well as a radiation oncologist, provide their opinion and talk to each other. That can happen in something called a tumor board at a cancer center. It doesn't have to be a tumor board. It can just be going and getting an opinion from each. But so many times we see patients who only see a surgeon and then don't see the medical oncologist until afterwards, when the medical oncologist is like, I could have helped you if I had known that. I would have given you chemo before the surgery to shrink that tumor so that the surgeon can go in and more easily take it out. Or they could say, I could have given you therapy after the surgery to prevent that tumor from coming back, but now it's back, right? So again, it's just really important to me that aside from clinical trials, which I also recommend looking at all stages, but that's really important to me, is having those three folks giving their opinion on almost every single cancer situation.
Yeah, let me put an underline under that public service announcement. So if anyone listening to this, now or in the future, if you are facing a cancer diagnosis and you've got a surgeon telling you, and the surgeon's the only person you met with saying, I can take it out, you likely got time, and you should be trying to involve a medical oncologist and a radiologist at your cancer center. That should be available. The surgeon should not look at you funny if you ask for that. If they do, that's a red flag. And we're here always to have those conversations if you need any support for that. But yeah, that's very clear that there's just there's so much that happens around the diagnosis, and there's such a system out there that you kind of get pulled into that. We've talked about there's one particular, I think it's Burkitt's lymphoma. If you have Burkitt's lymphoma, get it treated. You told me like go, but otherwise you likely have time. You can slow it down, even if it's just days to kind of get your bearings and things like that. I see too many people who feel very rushed
Right.
into things.
Right. And I don't think that benefits them. And
So
and to me, a second opinion is another thing to think about. And I know the second opinion, though, to me is best from a doctor who we know has something special to offer. And so someone who's running a clinical trial. And again, if a clinical trial is being run in your cancer center by that doctor that you happen to be seeing, then sure, you're likely to hear about it. But we know that only happens about 3% of the time, which is why 3% of cancer patients get onto clinical trials. For everyone else, for the 97%, that serendipity just doesn't happen. And therefore, we help it to happen by identifying doctors who have innovative approaches to go and speak with, just to get their opinion. Do they think it's better to go with the standard route or to go with the innovative route? Let's hear what they have to say about it. And so that's the other thing for patients who do have time and have the impetus and the advocacy, the self-advocacy, which again, we promote all the time, to go and do one step beyond it. Definitely getting in front of a doctor with one or more of these innovative options is, I think, the very best thing that you can do for yourself.
indeed. Well, I think we've reached the top of our time. So I think that's probably a good place to stop for today. We've definitely uncovered a number of topics we could go much deeper into, and we will in future sessions. So, Dr. Sager, thank you for your time today to do this. This is great to hear you talk about these things. To those of you listening, thank you for your time as well. I just want to emphasize that if Sagely Health can be a service to you in any way, we're here, whether that's just conversations about how do you get the best care out of your current team, how do you find trials. We kind of have a lot of different services we can offer for almost any situation for a cancer patient. So yeah, anything else you'd like to add today, Dr.
No,
Sager?
I'm looking forward to having many more sessions and helping lots more people. So this is great. Thanks a lot, Jeremy.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. All right.
All right.
What
Take
in
care.
there?